Have you ever wondered how people make these cool looking epoxy tables? Well, in this video, we're going to take some live edge slabs, make this epoxy table, show you how we cut it round, and I made a nice little half lap leg, and I'm going to show you how to do that as well. So there's a few different things involved with this, a little bit of learning that's going to go on. Hopefully you get something out of it. So stay tuned and we'll get started. So we're going to start off by just building a form for this epoxy. Now, it's very important that you seal this up really well. I've shown how to do this in several of my previous videos, so if you want to refer to those, check those after this one, and there's a playlist of epoxy projects that you can find. But what we use is an MDF, and we wrap everything with a house wrap tape, and the epoxy does not stick to the house wrap tape. So we cover all surfaces with that. And then with the form, you run a bead of silicone underneath each form piece and in between the ends. And what that'll do is it'll prevent any leakage from coming out the sides. When I first started doing these, I did not do this step, and I almost always had something leaking out, and then I was basically in a mad rush to try to figure out how to stop it. I tried hot glue and things like that. And the problem is you don't want to lose that epoxy because it's very expensive. So we silicone these down. We use pocket hole screws to screw them to the table. And I can keep reusing this table. You can see I have several different kinds of tape on it. Works really well. And that's really all there is to it. So get it to the size you want and just silicone everything so it's all sealed shut. After that, we're going to fit in our pieces that we want to use and then do a calculation for the amount of epoxy we're going to need. Now, the epoxy calculation, you're going to try to find volume. So you want to go the length of the epoxy area by the width of the epoxy area by the depth of the epoxy area. Now, it's not always easy to get the width because the live edge kind of tends to wander. So the calculation, once you just get an estimate on that width, you're going to multiply those numbers, and then you're going to divide by 61, and that will tell you how many liters of epoxy you need. If you want to convert it to ounces, gallons, whatever, just go on Google and take the liter amount that you came up with as a calculation and convert it into whatever units you need. Now we're ready for our first epoxy pour. Now before I start pouring epoxy, I always like to blow out the form, get all the little particles out because they'll end up being floaters if you don't get them. And then after that, you're going to mix in just a small amount of epoxy. We want to just cover the bottom of the form for this first pour. Now I'm going to take the mixing stick that I use, and I'm going to coat all the live edge where the epoxy is eventually going to run up against. And the reason for that is it helps to seal it so that down the road, I'm not going to have bubbles bubbling out in the middle of an epoxy pour. Because what happens is air can get trapped inside the wood pores and they can seep out at the wrong time. So if you don't want bubbles coming up through, this is a very important step. The other important part about this step is it's going to then drip down the edge. And like I said, we're going to just puddle the bottom of the entire form, and it will prevent any kind of leakage seeping out underneath the wood slabs as we pour subsequent pours. This will save you an epoxy cost and a lot of cleanup at the end. So it's a nice way to just seal it. If you pour too much the first time, basically gravity gets the weight of the epoxy weighs everything down and just tends to want to naturally push it up underneath the wood. So that's why we want to go real thin on this first layer. I'm looking maybe a 1/16 inch on the bottom is all I'm hoping to get. If I can get about that, that's about right. Now I use a product called Super Clear Tabletop Epoxy, and we're getting ready for our first pour here. They recommend on their website to only pour 1/4 of an inch deep. Now, I have been doing this for a while. I tend to pour a little deeper than that. on smaller projects like this. You just got to be careful. You got to watch the temperature and just make sure it doesn't get too hot. If you feel like you're mixing too much and it's getting too hot too fast, you need to definitely scale it back to that 1/4 inch depth. Otherwise, you could have the epoxy crack. Now, I have never had it crack in instances like this, so I keep pouring just a little bit deeper than that. Otherwise, it just takes a lot of pours to get to where we want to go. So we're probably hitting more like 3/8 on the thickness here. I have even gone a half in the past. So, but what I do is I want to mix this up. I add a mica pigment to it, and you can get all this stuff on Amazon. I'll put a link down in the description. But once you figure out the color you want, you need to figure out how see-through you want it. So, do you want to see some depth? Do you just want the color? There's certain times, like when I'm doing ocean-looking projects, I usually mix a little bit less color into it so I can see down through it deeper. For this, I didn't want to see the whole way through. I wanted it to be more opaque. So we mixed it. When I mix it, I look at my stick when I'm stirring. If I can still see the wood through the epoxy, I'll know if I need to add more or not, depending on what the look I'm going for. So once I get that mixed how I wanted to, just pour it in. You let it set. There's not a whole lot to do once you pour, other than I come back in and I'll pop bubbles with a heat gun, and that just helps clear it up quicker. You don't want to hold that heat gun in one place for too long, or you can overheat the epoxy. So you got to be kind of careful about it. It's just a quick, just over the top, pop the bubbles, and we're done. And we're going to keep doing this. Now, as you go on, as you get towards the top, you can kind of stir the epoxy as it's starting to harden. And you want to make sure you time it right. Don't get it to where it's already too hard and it's kind of like a thicker, I don't even know how to describe it. You can tell the difference. Like it's starting to harden maybe on top, but not underneath. And what happens is it gets way too thick. But if you stir it up a little bit, I feel like the color pigments sometimes settle to the bottom and you can kind of bring those back up. However, if you do it too early, they're just going to settle right back down again. So you want to time it, just stir it ever so often. And once you start seeing that it's getting a little thicker consistency, that's when you want to do the final stir to get it how you want to look at the end. But we'll just keep pouring these layers in, and I ended up running out of epoxy here with just about maybe an 1/8 of an inch, not even that, to go. And I just decided that's good enough. I didn't want to really wait on more to come. And so I could machine the wood down to the surface of the epoxy with no problem, and we'd be still sitting right where we want to be. So that's what we did, and then we move on to making the legs. Now it's time to cut the legs to width. And I want these to be perfectly square, so I'm going to actually cut each of these pieces twice, once each way, and then I actually will end up planing these as well, just to make sure they're very precise, and it also knocks some of those saw marks off. I did not show the planing part, but know that I did do that here after I cut these. Now, as I said on the screen there, I took the guard off for demonstration so you can see what I'm doing. Always use guards in place when you're using table saws or other equipment. It's purely so you can see what's going on here. After that, we just sand all the legs. These are also the cross pieces we're going to use down where we did the lap joint at the bottom, as you'll see here shortly. We just sand them up to final sanding, which I ended at 220 grit with these, and then we're ready to move on. Now it's ready to take the epoxy top out of the form. I just have to remove the screws and then just knock the form sides off. It's fairly easy to do with a hammer. You really just have to lightly tap and they'll pop free. And usually to get the top off, you have to use maybe a shim or something like that and drive it up underneath just to peel it off of the table. It tends to want to stick a little bit more there than it does the forms. But usually there's not a whole lot of difficulty in getting that up. You may want to use a couple shims depending on the size of the project and how tight it is, but it's usually not too much trouble. After that, the width of this is too wide for my planer, and like I said, I ran out of epoxy, and so I didn't want to spend a lot of time using like a belt sander to try to get this top down to the right size. So I took it to a local mill that surface planed it down just flush for me. And then after that, I sanded everything. I ended up going on the top to 320 grit sandpaper. I really wanted it extra smooth, and then I stopped after that. So now we're going to make the legs. The trick to these is everything is 15-degree angles. And what we're going to do is we're going to make the legs are going to be parallelograms. And the cross pieces that go between the legs are going to be trapezoids. So you just got to determine the height of the leg and then figure out how much spacing you want across the leg. It's just a little bit of calculations, but it isn't too difficult to do. We just need to make sure we get all the angles right. And I'm one that I'm always afraid I'm going to cut the wrong angle. So I always draw arrows on the legs once I mark them, just so I know what way it needs to go. I always just double check because it's so easy to mess these things up. Now we're going to set up the HalfLaps. They're going to be on the cross braces at the bottom of each leg. Now these can be a little bit tricky, but basically you want to do is you want to find the center of each cross brace and then measure out the width, half of the width of the piece it's going to cross. So if the pieces are 2 inches thick, from the center you're going to measure out 1 inch each direction and make marks, and you're going to do that on each leg. Then on one, or not on each leg, on each cross brace. Then on one of those cross braces, you're going to measure up from the bottom half of the thickness. So if the legs are 2, you're going to measure up from the bottom 1, and you're going to make a mark the whole way across. That will get cut out. On the other cross brace, you're going to measure down from the top 1 inch and make a mark. Connect it with the 2 lines that are going across, and that'll get cut out. And those 2 cutouts will then cross each other in like a lap joint, and it should fit nice and securely and end up being a real nice tight joint that looks good, it's strong, and kind of an easy way to assemble 2 items together. To the table saw. Now I've set the fence to the furthest I want it to go over. So I make 1 cut, and this is only going halfway through, and then I'm going to flip it. I'm going to make the second cut. Now that will lay out where the widest point of this cut lap joint is going to be. Once I make that cut, I will just nibble away at the wood in between those 2 cuts. And what it's going to do is going to create a void there that will allow the one piece to overlap the other piece. And you'll see as we go here exactly what I'm talking about. Now there are probably a little bit quicker ways to do this. If you had a blade called a dado blade, you could cut these away really quick. I have a dado blade that I've never actually used, and the problem is that you need to create like a new plate around the blade there. You see it on my table saw, the blue plate. You need to create a new one that has a wider gap for this dado blade, and you got to cut out that oval. And it was just, I was looking at it, and there was so much work involved to do that. I thought it's going to be quicker just to cut it away with the normal single width blade on this time. And I'll worry about making that dado blade slot later when I have more time, and I'll have to worry about trying to get this job done. So here we go. We nibble away at it. Once we're done with this first one, we're going to do the exact same thing on the second one, but the second one is just going to be flipped over. So right now I'm cutting the bottom side of this cross brace. The second one, I cut the top side, and then they just overlap when you put them together. And you'll see that here in just a moment. So now we're on to the second piece. I'm going to do the exact same thing I just did, but this time I'm just cutting it off the top side of the cross brace instead of the bottom. And we will cut each end, we'll nibble away the middle, and everything should just work out real good here. So we're going to hurry up through this and fast forward a little bit and get to the point where we put this together. Now I'm just going to apply some wood glue to both HalfLaps and attach them. Now I'm going to just put a clamp in the middle, double check for squareness because it could get slightly out of square. It was tight, but it wasn't so tight I couldn't budge it. So I just had to tweak it a little bit for squareness, but it fit together really well and everything clamped together. I didn't have to use any other fasteners for this. I didn't put any screws up to the bottom or anything like that. I just literally glue overlapping. And it's all going to hold itself together because they're going to be screwed to the legs anyways. So it'll all stay in place. So no fasteners are necessary here. Now my customer wants a circle top, so we are going to cut this out on the CNC router. I know it's going to be precise, and that's why I chose to use the router. If you didn't have a CNC router, there are jigs you can use with a handheld router that can make circles. You could cut it out with a jigsaw, scroll saw, bandsaw, anything like that. It just adds a little bit of difficulty. But it is still important that once you're done cutting it out, sand all the edges. I take mine to a disc sander. I don't show it on here, but I took it to a disc sander just to clean things up a little bit. And then I decided to take the cutout to my routing table and just put a nice little round over on it. It's nice to have your table edges have some sort of a bevel or a round over. That way, if someone were to fall and hit their head, especially like little kids, they don't get split open as easily. And it just, I think it makes it look a little bit nicer if there's a little bit of a round over on the edge. So that's what we do, and then we're ready to move on. I felt some of the machining I had done just may have had a negative impact on the sanding surface that I did previously. So we're going to come back in here, and I'm just going to do a nice sanding job. I'm also cleaning up a little bit of the router sanding just to make sure that there was a nice transition from the surface to the roundover. But we're going to bring everything up to 320 grit sandpaper. That is enough for what we're going to do. I can get the epoxy looking nice and clear, and I have no worries about that. And if I were doing like a crystal clear looking epoxy, I probably would want to go higher and probably wet sand and things like that. But because we did more of a solid color, I'm not that worried. It looks really good, trust me, just going up to 320 if you do this right. So we're going to do that and move on to leg assembly. So for assembly purposes, I decided to use my pocket hole jig and drill pocket holes in the bottom sides of the cross brace where they're going to attach to the leg. Now, this was fairly simple to do. There is a little bit of an angle, as you can see on the end, that 15-degree angle. It really had no effect on the pocket holes. And even if it did, my legs are thick enough. The screws I was going to use, they weren't going to go through. So I wasn't overly concerned about that little gap down there at the bottom. Now that brings us to assembling the legs. This was not fun. I decided I wanted to clamp a block to the leg as a stop block so that I could get a consistent height off the bottom because I wanted a little bit of gap between these cross braces and the floor. So I'm using other leg pieces to give that spacing, clamping a 1x above that so that when I go to screw this in, it doesn't drive it too far up. The problem is that these are all angled legs and there's no flat place to clamp on. So I was having an extremely difficult time trying to get these legs clamped together so that I could put pocket hole screws in. Now, I end up here trying to tape the cross brace to the leg just to keep it in place enough for me to hold it and screw it in. And that actually does not work, but I was kind of on the right track. Now, I accidentally did not record this, but what I ended up doing was I clamped the cross piece to the leg piece on the sides just to hold it in place so it wouldn't move. so it wouldn't shift left to right, and everything would stay lined up. And then I just kind of used brute strength and held it in place the rest of the way. So I didn't get that on here, but it was just a big flat clamp that I used between those two. And it ended up working out really well, but it took me some figuring, and wasn't the most fun part of this project. Next, I marked the top pieces that were going to hold at least two of the legs apart, and I cut them to length. I pocket hold them. I screwed them in place, and that established the one set of legs. You're never going to see these two pieces because you're going to see I'm going to wrap them with a little bit more decorative piece that extends out and allows me to attach the legs to my top. So this is going to take a little bit of a process here, but you'll see how it works out. So what I decided to do was create pieces that lap across the middle at the top that had a little bit more of a decoration type look to them. So you won't actually see the top of these legs as they are right now. What I did was I cut 15-degree angles again on pieces just so everything was the same. And I made them extend out past the legs. There's actually going to be pocket holes on the inside, which is what I'm going to use to attach to the top. And I have to cut a notch out for the pieces that are going to go across the other way, so 90 degrees to these pieces I'm attaching now. So I'll cut two exactly the same. I'll attach them on the first set of legs, and then I'll come in and cut two that fit into those and attach them on the other two sets of legs. So we're going to work through that, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about as we progress here. Now, one thing I didn't want to do was worry about the glue not holding onto the legs. So I actually did tack everything in this process right here with a nail gun. And I tacked it clear at the very top where nobody's ever going to see it. And then I actually did countersink those later on and make sure I covered them up with a little bit of putty just to make sure, just because I like everything to look clean. But they're in a spot where nobody would ever see them anyways. So I thought that would just be best to help hold everything in place and make it a little bit stronger than just the glue. So now we're just going to do the other side. You can see I made a little bit different cut, and it's going to fit right up over all of the other pieces that are in the middle and comes up flush right to the top with the top of the legs. And we're able to easily attach that onto the legs with some glue. Again, a little bit of nail gun, just tacking at the very, very top just to hold it in place. And everything is good and ready for finish. And my customer for this project wanted it to have kind of a golden oak stain. We are using ash for this. And I know early American looks really nice on like a white oak, and I just thought that might be just what they're looking for. I sent them a sample. They said they loved it. And so I am applying a stain. Now I got to be careful. I don't want to put the stain on the epoxy if I can avoid it, just because it can create a little bit of discoloration. Even though it does wipe off, it can soak in just a little bit, and I don't want it to happen. So I'm very careful to just try to keep as much of it off the epoxy as possible. As with any kind of Minwax oil-based stain, you're just going to wipe it on, let it penetrate for a little bit, and then wipe it off with a clean rag. Always make sure when staining and using rags to dispose of them properly. Do not throw them in a pile. Do not throw them in your trash can. Read the can by the manufacturer. See what they recommend. I know I like to hang mine up outside if I can, to where air can dry them completely. Like lay them out flat in the gravel driveway to where there's no way it could catch something on fire, and it can just dry completely that way. There are other ways I believe you can soak them in water and things like that, but you need to check your manufacturer and see how they recommend disposing of rags. So that is just my little caution. You don't want to burn your shop or house down. So please be careful with this. And then we're just going to do the same thing to the legs. We're going to flip over the top once it's dry, do the exact same thing with the top, and then we're ready for the finish that we're going to put on this table. For the protective coat on these tables, I really like to use a product called Odie's Oil if I can. And it is, I think it's just a mixture between an oil and a wax, is my understanding. And I highly recommend it. It really makes the grain pop, brings out the real natural characteristics of it. It protects the wood well. It's easy to apply. It smells really good, actually, when you put it on. The shop just smells amazing. And all you have to do is take like a 3M Scotch-Brite pad at like a really fine grit one and dip it in, and then just rub it in a circular motion and just try to work that finish into the grain pores. And the one nice thing about using it with epoxy is once you run that over the epoxy, it just makes it shine, brightens it right up, and gives it that look that you are really going for. So we work this in on everything. We're going to work it in on both sides of the top. We're going to work it in on the legs. And then what you do at the very end is you just take a terry towel or some kind of a buffing cloth and buff it out. You can kind of use a power buffer if you want to. You just got to be careful. Make sure your speed setting's right and you're using the right buffing pad. But I usually just use a towel. It doesn't take very long. You just want to make sure you get all the product off. And what you're going to do is wait a few hours after you apply. You basically just buff it out like you would a car wax, really. You work it on, let it harden a little bit on there, and then work its way in, dry out, and then buff out any excess. And it turns out really nice. I highly recommend it. I'll put a link down in the description if you want to get a hold of some of this stuff and try it out yourself. And to finish the whole project off, all I had to do is center those legs on the top, and I just kept taking measurements over and over, making minor adjustments until I felt that it was dead center on the top. It's kind of hard with this shape of a leg to actually figure out where to place it, but once I had it in place, I got some pocket hole screws, screwed everything in, and it turned out great. So there you have it. It turned out really well. I've actually never made legs quite like this, where we did that cross lap in the bottom. Took a little bit of figuring, but it's fairly simple to do. Every angle I used was 15 degrees, and then I just had to figure out how long I wanted these legs, and then determine how wide I wanted the base. So it wasn't too hard to figure out. You could easily customize it to whatever situation you wanted to do. Hopefully you learned a little bit on how to do an epoxy tabletop with the live edge, building a form, and although we used a CNC router to cut this circle out, you could do it by hand. It's just a little bit more complicated. Or if you didn't want to do a round top, you could do a rectangular square top as well. So this project really isn't that high of a level skill. The legs were a little bit tricky, but you could do something a lot more basic if you wanted to. And it doesn't really require that many tools. So it's a nice project for someone just starting out, figuring things out, and we'll make a nice piece for the home it's going into. So thanks for watching, and check some of these videos out on the next screen. We'll catch you next time.